Accessibility, practical fixes from EA Madden's NFL franchise. I'm Karen Stevens, and I'm a software engineer on the Madden team, Electronic Arts, and occasionally I'm also a product owner. Interesting story behind that. So, quite a few years ago, I had a friend tell me, I said, "Oh, I know you're a huge Raiders fan. Are you looking forward to playing the next version of Madden?" And he replied, "I can't play Madden." I'm like, "Well, why can't you play?" And he's like, "Well, I'm low vision." I said, "Yeah, I know." He's like, "Well, that means that like anything that moves, I have a really hard time seeing if it's too small. So like pass icons, for example, or anything that moves on the field, I don't have time to react. I can't see it, so I don't know how to catch the ball. So I had to give up playing." I said, "Well, I can't promise you anything, but I can say this. If I ever get an opportunity to do something about that, I will." So fast forward to summer of 2014, Tiburon Game Studios, EA Game Studios, had an internal game jam. So my feature was Madden Game Accessibility, and it happened to win for Best Feature. So that allowed me to pitch the idea and get some traction, and this is what came in to Madden 17. So what is accessibility? Disability is a mismatch between a person and their environment. Accessibility is correction of this mismatch. By this definition, you could actually say a tall person is disabled if they're on an airplane, because they do not match their environment. Actually saying that someone has like a hearing impairment, that's a medical condition. That doesn't actually define who they are. So when we design software, we can design it to try to include as many people as possible, and that's what accessibility is. Here you see two charities listed. Both of these charities, and there are many others, these two happen to focus mostly on configurable controllers and actual solutions for people who can't use their hands or have trouble with fine motor skills. They provide them options. And that's great, but hardware only goes so far. It's important to consider this at a software level too. Accessibility is a mindset. It's not just one feature, it's considering your user the entire way through. Because it's really a form of usability. It's cheaper to plan it than to try to tack it on as an afterthought. We all know what happens when you have feature creep. Things can quickly get out of scope, so it's good to think about it from the very beginning. And it doesn't mean that it has to be that expensive. Everything you saw here was done within a month, almost entirely by me. So I took the role of product owner, designer, developer. I did some UI placeholder art. I pretty much did the whole thing. So it doesn't take much necessarily to get a big win with your audience. So why is this important? Well, 19% of the US population currently has some form of disability. 25% of today's 20-year-olds will be disabled by retirement. You may wonder why these numbers don't match. It is true that many people who have a disability also have health issues which may reduce the mortality rate, and that's why these numbers don't quite match. The presentation here is mainly focused on visual issues, and it's interesting that 25 million are visually impaired, and about 1 in 12 men, 1 in 200 women are colorblind. And that is not included in those visually impaired numbers. So I'm sure everybody here has already used the accessible feature. How many people have in their game set a brightness setting, contrast, gamma control? Have you been in a bar and seen subtitles on the TV? All those are accessibility settings. You may want to do something like, you have a child, you don't want to wake up, so you mute the TV. You're eating something, so you really don't want to use 2 hands. All this are technically accessibility, even though really there is nothing disabled about you. So yes, as I said earlier, there are many settings such as volume control that already exists. Now, one pushback I heard is, well, this is fundamentally changing your appearance of the game. What if you go on YouTube and you see the game looks different than you would expect? How are we going to communicate this? So the solution was, and I know it's hard to see here, and which is intentional, is a light watermark that sits in the bottom corner. And it will let us know that if someone's like, why is this so strange looking? We can say, well, they have an accessibility setting turned on. I can see this little watermark. And the settings can be used to prevent altering the original game experience. So Madden without any accessibility turned on is pretty much what you would expect based on the previous versions of the series. So here are the Madden accessibility settings. As I mentioned, I was a one-man band for this. There's a few consequences and rooms for improvement. This is a journey. This is not a single step in the process. So they are there, but they're a little buried. They're a little buried because I did the UI myself, and I'm not a UI developer, so I kind of just did the best I could to make sure it shipped. I'm hoping that at some point maybe we can polish that a little, but this is sufficient. You can turn it on, turn it off, works great. So, size. So we talked about enlarge. It's pretty obvious to say things should be big enough so you can see them. And there should be, enough contrast so you can tell what they are. This kind of puts numbers to it. Now, I'll admit that I've been to accessibility talks this week since I started writing these slides, and I saw a recommendation of instead of 30 pixels tall to use 40. I would say use as big as you can. Like, if you can do 40, by all means do that. That's a great idea. I did not get that information till this week, which is why it's not in the slide deck. 30 is good too. I would not recommend smaller than 30. If you go onto forums and you look at what sizes people start to complain about, you'll notice that around anything below 30, you get increasing number of complaints the lower you go. So I would recommend keeping things as big as possible. 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio is pretty much an industry standard. I know that's kind of a vague thing, so I have an addendum slide that covers tool and resources links, so you can actually see what that means. So, as I mentioned, my friend couldn't see the pass icons. Here's an example of what the pass icons normally look like. They're the little buttons that are above players' heads. This is what happens when you turn enlarge on. So it's significantly bigger, and between the two, my friend was able to now play Madden again because he can now see the pass icons. It doesn't just affect the pass icons, it affects anything that is like a button type thing that would appear on the field in Madden. So if there's like a tackle battle icon, there's a catch icon, all of them would be enlarged. So at the same time, enlarge changes the kick meter. The kick meter usually lies in the field. It might be angled up a little bit, but it moves around depending on your camera angle, and its size can vary depending on your camera angle, which can be a little hard for somebody with a visual impairment to find, let alone use. So to counteract that, when you turn on enlarge, instead of it being in world space, it switches to screen space. So it's always in the exact same location, and it's large and easy to see, and you know exactly where it's going to be. So this made it a lot easier for people like my friend who would be like, where is that thing? I can't make out the line. It's too thin, it's too small. This solves it for him. And it really wasn't hard to do. It took, like, literally this one I think only took like a day, if that. So reception. At the same time, I announced on EA's news forum that Madden was coming out with accessibility features. I also created an EA accessible Twitter account, which I have on a later slide, and I created an accessibility feedback email so I can get people's reaction and information and things. So I had a better idea of how we were meeting our users' needs. So it was an overwhelming positive response when they heard about these features. As you see here, I know they're kind of small, but like as a visually impaired person, this may be the best news from EA since before CFM, which is like one of our franchise modes. I want to thank you for these suggestions. I've been struggling to tell the difference between a circle and a square, but no longer. Great addition, I don't have the best eyes anymore, so this makes me happy. And so on and so forth. It was overwhelming positive, which was really great to see. Power post-processing. So one thing about Madden is we have lots of assets, and would be not really feasible for us to make an extra version of all of them to cover accessibility. So we had to come up with something that that would cover the game and be adequate for our needs. So looking at this, put in some sort of filter that covered colorblind, brightness, and contrast, and it did not require any asset changes. As again I said earlier, it affects 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women. This amounts to over 500,000 Madden players. That's a lot of people who can't see our game very well. So to illustrate exactly what this means, the NFL kind of ran into this head first last season, where they had an all-red team versus an all-green team, and this is what the two teams looked like on this TV screen. People couldn't tell which team was which, and since then the NFL has decided they've hired a colorblind specialist to make sure that the matchups of the teams next year can always be detected with people who are colorblind. Well, that's great for the NFL that they can do that, but with Madden, you can pick any uniform you want. So because of that, we can't do, especially since people may pay real-world money to use our particular uniforms in certain cases, we can't do that to them. So then it becomes down to, okay, so how do we solve that problem? We need to solve something. Now, in addition to the red versus green problem, we also had a UI issue, multiple really. Here's one of the more painful ones. The image on the left is the way a normal normal vision person would see this. The one on the right is somebody who has red weak color blindness. As you can see, the dark red arrow in particular kind of disappears. The problem is that putting red on black is actually pretty common in Madden. So this was causing numerous issues, not just I'm confused on what color it is, it's, oh, I didn't know there was UI there. So primary goal was to fix this, I didn't know it was there. If you don't know it's there, it doesn't really matter what color it is. So secondary goal was to make it so people would be able to tell the difference between the arrows. So since I'm going to refer to this many times, this is called play call. This is what it looks like. As you see here, there's different arrows, and these arrows are more than just these colors. We have a wide variety of colors. So here, I looked at now the colors you want to avoid here are red, orange, yellow, green, those combinations. So to ask, do we ever do that in Madden? We kind of do it all over the place. In fact, it's more common for us to do it than not do it. So it was definitely an issue. Some people couldn't see certain areas on the field at all. So that definitely needed to be addressed. So I looked at math fixes. I tried Daltonization, just standard Daltonization. It's an algorithm by Stanford University. It calculates where a person's vision is weakest in color, and it shifts it and reduces the color space to where it's strongest. So that's great. It was designed for videos and photographs, and it works awesome for those cases. Unfortunately, that's not a video game. A video game has lots of really bright colors, and it turns out that Daltonization tends to squish the colors so they're on top of each other, which meant that when I applied it to play call, for example, we had some issues of normal vision in people not being able to tell the arrows apart. So like no one can tell them apart. So great idea, didn't quite work. So I modified it. I realized that there's a way you can shift the colors around. So instead of having the worst possible case scenario for games, you can improve it so you can differentiate bright colors more. And the way I tested this was I used play call first, and I invited colorblind individuals over and asked, how many colors do you see and where do you see them? I didn't want to lead them. I didn't want to give them any indication of what the answer would be. And I'll tell you, the first time I had someone go and say, well, these two are obviously the same color. And I'm like, I obviously have more work to do. I'll call you back in a couple days. So it took a few iterations, but we got to the point where originally only about 1/3 of people could relatively tell the colors, to everybody could tell exactly how many colors there were. And then I got feedback of, oh my God, why are there so many colors? What did they do? I thought I knew how to play this game. I've been on Madden for years and I have no idea what I'm doing. So that's a good problem to have. That means they have work to do, but that's like the best possible outcome. There was a very negligible hit on game performance. It was this tiny fraction of a millisecond. We didn't really notice it at all. For those of you who are graphics oriented, for our version, it did not require a full screen pass. Madden uses FXAA to smooth out jagged edges in gameplay. So we put it on there, and then we also put it on the UI that was not affected by that. So just by tacking onto existing things, we could shift the colors around, and we didn't have to do anything else. And that's one of the reasons why it was so cheap. So bonuses is that in order to do my modified version, it partially is using brightness and contrast controls, which I also exposed, because those can also help a lot of people. So here's an example of how this changed. So the image on the right and the bottom are both someone who's colorblind. The image on the left is the original image. As you can see, if you look on the right image, how the red arrows are almost gone, they're very visible on the bottom image, that they look more blue. So this significantly helped people's ability to see everything on the screen. And we had a lot of people who are now confused because they could see things they couldn't before. So this is what it looks like when it's applied to the whole game for a normal vision user. As you can see, it doesn't look that different. It really depends on what type of color blindness you have. And by the way, I'm not saying this is a one fix, stop, fix all things. First of all, it had to be tuned in order for the overlap to fall in a good spot. Second of all, this doesn't mean that if you're doing palette swapping instead, that's necessarily bad. I would just encourage you to consider your background colors when you're doing that, to make sure that you're not inadvertently moving the colors around and then blending into your background when you're colorblind, because I've seen that happen quite a bit too. There really is no silver bullet. Each approach is valid, but this worked really well for Madden, and it will work well for similar titles. So reception. This is a minor thing to most of us, but people with color blindness and eye troubles, it's huge. Lots of thank yous, lots of people saying that this is the best thing ever. It was overwhelmingly positive. We have lots of people who didn't, like I said, didn't realize they didn't understand the game the way they expected it to be. So it was very gratifying to see that it helped so many people. I also, like I said, added brightness and contrast support. I support 5 levels of each. Here's the brightness, and then here's the contrast. Here's a bonus to the brightness and contrast. So like I said, there's no silver bullet. I got an email a few weeks ago from somebody who was complaining about, did anybody who was colorblind actually test this? It didn't work for me, I can't see it at all. So I said, I'm sorry you're having issues. Can you please tell me a little bit of information? What settings are you using? What type of color blindness do you have? And have you tried increasing the contrast value? I never heard from them again. Until about a week ago or so. And then I saw somebody reference on a Twitter, the person referenced me on Twitter saying, yeah, you should talk to this person, she's super helpful. And I'm like, oh, okay, so it did work for you, great, that's good to know. Before that, I'm like, well, I'm not gonna hassle them. But yeah, no, so it was really useful to have that there, so people who have significant issues, and that person even admitted that they had a severe form of colorblindness. So that was really helpful. Recap, it's a mindset, not a feature. It really should be considered at every step in the development process. It really should be considered from the requirements phase. Like when we had mock-ups for even the current version of Madden, I went through with the art directors and said, okay, I see your mock-ups on the web. They're like, oh no, those aren't real yet. I'm like, I know, that's why we're talking about it now, before we implement them. So to go through, and we actually corrected some things. The best thing you could possibly do is correct things before you actually do them. So a lot of the biggest wins are things you'll never know about, which is actually a plus. It's possible to have big wins cheaply, like I said here, everything here was under a month. It wasn't much at all. And engage your audience. Not just, for warm fuzziness, but like what I do is I take all this feedback in, and I have an internal website I made, and I compile different games into different web pages, and then I can send links off to other teams saying, all these people have a problem with this feature in your game. We should really talk about this. And it gives a lot more momentum behind it. That's really the best way for me to get things done right now, is just based on user feedback. And it gives an idea of where our pain points are. And I would encourage you all to do something. It could be as simple as setting up a Twitter account. That's what I did. To just get information from your audience and find out what they really need. So the Twitter account is EA accessible. I recommend following it if you're interested in future updates on anything to do with accessibility for Madden. Accessibilityfeedback@ea.com is the email that's used externally for gathering feedback. If you don't remember that, if you remember the Twitter account, the email is listed in the profile of the Twitter account. So there are additional slides in this deck that cover tool and reference links. So here's some examples. Don't worry. It's in the vault, by the way, so you don't have to worry about that too much. If you can't access it, I've already been given permission to share it externally. So if you go back to the accessibility feedback or the Twitter, either way, and give me your contact information, and I'll make sure you get it. So, and here's the funny part. The code's actually in the slide deck. So the brightness, contrast, and all this is literally small enough to be in the notes. All of it is actually in a note. If you get the PDF files, the last couple of pages of the PDF is the code. And yes, I did clear this with legal first. If you have any questions about using it or legal questions about it, once again, contact me, and I'll make sure you get in touch with the right people. A lot of you may have already spoken to me because I've been walking the floor saying, have you considered colorblind support? And been handing out literal packets of paper. If any of you would like a packet now, I have a few left. Not many, but a few. So yes, I would say definitely look in the vault. And yes, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? No questions? You have a question?
Hello. As you know, I also worked on a title where we retrofitted some accessibility features. But I was wondering, so one of the things that I kept running into was it would be a feature, but it would be a feature outside my team. Not my group of developers I was working with, but with someone else. So how do you go about, you kind of mentioned talking to some of the other teams, but when you find something that isn't yours that you need, you realize that it could be more accessible, how do you kind of start that conversation?
So unfortunately, first of all, I'm hearing impaired. Second of all, the echo is distorting your voice. So I'm not entirely, can you come closer? And I'll repeat your question.
So when you find an accessibility feature or something that isn't accessible and you want to get it updated, but it's not within your team, you kind of mentioned already talking to some of the other teams, how do you go about working with people outside your group to get the work done?
Cool. The question is, if I got feedback from a team other than Madden, how do I go about getting that information back to the team? A couple of ways. First of all, about a year ago, I created an internal email list. So people inside of EA who are particularly interested in accessibility are on it, which covers actually a surprising good cross-section of the company. So that gives me a starting point of contacting other teams. And usually based on that, I can find the right person. And then I just have a list of names, basically, at this point, where I go to to get feedback. Yes?
So it's kind of related to the last question. So other teams that you passed on feedback to, what has their response to it been, their reaction? Have you got any tips for others when you do the same thing?
So the question was, how do other teams react to getting feedback? They've been pretty good about it, really. I mean, generally speaking, people want to know if people are having trouble using your software. None of us are sitting down saying, I want to write games that people can't use. So generally speaking, they're pretty interested in finding out what people are having trouble with. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean things move quickly. Just because they are all big games, they're all pretty much all AAA titles, and it can take a while. So it doesn't mean necessarily something is going to be hit immediately, but at least they're aware of it and have the opportunity to address it, which they wouldn't otherwise. Anything else? No? Okay then. Well, thank you all so much for coming.